Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, in the name of God, most gracious, most merciful. Assalamu alaikum. Peace and blessings be upon each and every one of you. Let me begin by thanking the leadership in this church and the members of this church by having the moral clarity and courage to host this conversation here. Can we give it up for the church here? Secondly, I want to thank our dear beloved Father Mitri for convening this conversation with us. It is, I cannot say enough about the purpose of also supporting al-Kalima and Bright Stars and his institution. It is, without really any exaggeration, one of the most dynamic, thriving universities, even in this country, devoted to arts and culture and cultural expression that I have ever seen, let alone to see this in Bethlehem and to now have to witness images of the rubble of this university, this project, committed to what? Cultural expression, dynamism, telling our stories. What reason on earth could there be to decimate an institution like this in Gaza other than just brutal, raw terror? And so, please, I want to acknowledge, if you go to this university, you see Muslims, Christians, kids of all that are thriving in film and arts and culture and dance and music. It is extraordinary. Our delegation, Black Jerusalem, of which I have Dr. Crystal Truscott, who was on that, and I believe I see Sister Sydney Wallace, also from one of the oldest Jewish African-American congregations in the country, that's here with us tonight. It was part of this multi-faith delegation called Black Jerusalem that were here. I also see my mother. I always have to shout her out, or I get in trouble. That's here. My mother was born in May of 1948. She was literally born in the thick of a Nakba, fleeing an ancient village called Ain Karam, which is, some of you may know, where her father, who's still alive, my grandfather, can tell us stories of, 96. And my mother was in flight. So she has witnessed, she was born during a Nakba and now witnessing and protesting another Nakba in front of her face. One thing you may not know about this village, it is now really a town outside of Jerusalem. It sits underneath Yad Vashem, and the painful irony of a institution that we visited, that of course, to commemorate the horrific horror and to encounter the horror of the Holocaust, which we should all be familiar with. We should all commit our lives to making sure anything like that never happens again to any people. Yet the Palestinians have to then bear the brunt in so many ways of that legacy, including having the very institution built on top of stolen land from Ain Karam, my grandfather's land, which in 1946, my grandfather will tell you this today, the Palestinians there, Christian and Muslim, by the way, that is the town of the birthplace of John the Baptist, right? A sacred place with some of the most sacred religious tourism outside of the old city of Jerusalem happening in around Jerusalem. Then in 1946, the Palestinians in Ain Karam gladly, willingly, and beautifully hosted refugees, Jewish refugees seeking asylum from the Holocaust, Polish refugees, over maybe 250 of them. And this is documented. My grandfather will talk to you about how they fed each other, took care of each other, and they welcomed their presence. So this, among many myths, that the Palestinians not only were incapable of identifying and empathizing with Jewish suffering, but the Palestinians themselves is a community that was composed of Jewish identity. On my father's side, I have Jewish cousins. This may sound weird, but for early 20th century Palestinians, it is not uncommon. Palestinians intermarried, Christian, Jewish, Muslims. This idea that somehow it was like this myth of a conflict between Jews and Muslims is absolutely asinine. And anyone with any sense of historical veracity will tell you, One of the most famous memoirists of the early 20th century, Palestinian memoirists, is a man by the name of Wasif Jawhariya. He was a Greek Orthodox Christian, memorized Quran, was the famous oud player. He'll talk about going to, Orthodox fasting with his friends during Ramadan. He had memorized the entire Quran. He would go to his friends with Ramadan. Then they would go to Purim. Then they would go to Easter things. And then they would go party at night in the Nashashibi residence. That was early 20th century Palestinian life, right? That was very common. This is not a myth. And I must speak to myths, and we must, as communities of faith, we have a tradition, kula qawla sadida, say a word that is truthful and straightforward. Speak it plain, as Malcolm used to say. And I want to acknowledge, speaking of Malcolm, our great Dr. Carruthers, who in the spirit of Black liberation and a Evistonian that was here fighting for the principles of Black liberation and basic human dignity. Can we give it up for Dr. Carruthers? I'm honored to speak with them. And beyond humbled and honored to be with this extraordinary human being, that I was shouting out last week at Northwestern during the encampment, during Passover, while this man was actually leading that delegation that he spoke of. So I just want to publicly acknowledge how humbled I am to be here with you. But I want to speak it plain. We have to speak it plain. As spiritual folks, let's speak it truthfully. Let's not be among those that, as the Quranic verse, تَلْبَسُوا الْحَقِّ بِالْبَاطِلِ, that we dress truth with falsehood in the name of this kind of despicable, insidious concept of complexity. Look, a lot of us are academics. We can sit with complexity all day long. Right? As long as we don't use that as a way to duck and dodge uncomplicated truths. The uncomplicated truths. There are people that would hear what our beloved Reverend opened up with about this colonial state, the colonial settler project, and now they're trying to criminalize that discourse. They're trying to criminalize that. That somehow that is anti-Semitic, to suggest that Israel is a settler colonial project. Again, is there any sentient being left in these conversations that has any sense of history, right? I mean, I want someone that can make T-shirts out here. I want a T-shirt. Here's a T-shirt idea. You're gonna make thousands out, especially in this month, maybe even more than that. I want the this T-shirt to say, Zionism is a colonizing adventure, quote unquote. Listen to this and go make thousands and then write some checks to Iman and other nonprofits. Zionism, put black and white T-shirt. Zionism is a colonizing adventure. And I want you to wear this into the halls of Congress, into the president's office of your universities. And then I want on the back, I want you to know who said that? Jabotinsky, a Ukrainian Jewish refugee who goes on to be one of the most important ideologues in the Zionist thoughts. But he wasn't alone. He wasn't alone. In 1899, when Kipling was writing his beautiful White Man's Burden, again, any historian would just say of course it was a colonizing project because everyone was talking about colonial narratives at that time. When Kipling was writing that in 1899 in the New York Times, Conference of Zionists elect delegates at their meeting in Baltimore will colonize Palestine. This is the New York Times. And they delegated Rabbi Gothel and Wise were chosen as members to go attend. They weren't hiding this. Colonization. Golden Meir, who President Biden likes to talk about meeting, who I had a chance to directly confront the president on, talks about what? Palestine. A land without what? A land without what? People. For a people without a land. That is the sick, demented, colonizing narrative that was used, of course, across, not only to take lands from Palestine, but lands across Africa, Asia. It was the colonizing narrative. And among other facts, uncomplicated facts, were that the early Zionist conference and Zionist thinkers were thinking about other places aside from Palestine. In fact, they were thinking about even other places that were under colonial rule of the British to possibly settle. Uganda was a very serious consideration. Am I making that up? This is real. Ask any historian. And in fact, Do you know many of the Zionist conference leaders at the time thought, okay, Uganda, let's try Uganda. You know who refused Uganda as a possibility? This is a beauty right here. Were the other colonists from Britain that said, no, we already got this. We already got this, bruh. Go find somewhere else to colonize. We've already colonized this joint. What am I getting at? I am trying to get at that I also, part of taking faith seriously in this moment, and I take faith seriously among all of our traditions, is calling out, but calling up. Calling in and calling up. Calling up to some of the most profound ideals in our and principles in our traditions, and I believe those principles still exist in all of our traditions, and I believe they've animated the greatest liberation movements of our times, and going back to the times of the prophets, of the great prophets. And part of that is acknowledging that, as Rabbi was speaking, is that Palestinians do not have a problem connecting with and celebrating Jewish ancestral connection to the land. There is nothing about that notion that is untrue to us. The Quran, if you don't know this, the Quran mentions the Prophet Muhammad around a handful of times. Peace and blessings be upon him. Moses is mentioned in the Quran over 125 times. The stories of Bani Israel, the children of Israel, are as much our stories as they are anyone else's stories. And so while we can respect religious traditions, religious exclusivism that says you can only talk about Jesus, coming to a white evangelical from the middle of Alabama telling me I could only, if I know about Jesus and if I've accepted Jesus as my Lord and Savior, when I have a grandfather that comes from the village of John the Baptist, is asinine. Like, you're talking to Palestinians about knowing Jesus and accepting him. We know about Jesus. We love Jesus. We love Mary. I love Moses. We love these stories. And in these stories, in these abilities, but we have to call out. We have to call out. Because this is not about, it's about a certain type of toxic trifecta that has animated the conquest of this land and all other lands that we have to call out. And what is that trifecta made out of? It's made out of, number one, if we want to speak honestly about it, it was the eugenicist projects of the early turn of the century, right? That this idea that there's an evolved race, and that race deserves to colonize and conquer and control and civilize the savages. When they passed the $24 billion recently, it was Netanyahu not only thanking the Congress and apologists for the Israel in this country, they were saying this is good for Western civilization. That was their language. They're still using that language, that Israel will be a sea of civility in a island of civility in a sea of barbarity. That was the trope of the eugenicists that were colonizing, this idea that there's an evolved race. Second is theology. They have always deployed theology. They deployed it here. The manifest destiny was used and perverted verses from the curse of Ham to subjugate and kill and rape, mass rape. Do we talk about really what truly has ever happened on this land? We had a moment of, what do they call it? A racial reckoning. We barely, and we thank in Evanston for serious conversations about reparations, but those are barely happening. But it's the sick, perverted dementation of religious texts. And it's happening now, this idea that we can only exclusively claim the stories of Moses. And now all of this is ours. Forget that Jabotinsky came from the Ukraine. Forget that your families have been here for hundreds of years. Now it's all ours. Every inch of it, and we could do anything we want to anyone on there. We can put you in our military courts. We can rape your children, which they do in their prisons that nobody's talked about. We can completely steal every inch of your land. We can uproot your olive trees, the same trees that, again, the rabbi spoke, that when I hear the father talk about the deafening silence of the Christian church in America that says you love Jesus, said these trees that were around during the times of Jesus, these Christians community, they bombed the fourth oldest church in the world, decimated it, no Hamas infrastructure, nothing. And there was not a word of condemnation from a vast majority of Christians in this country. Why? Because that's not the words of Jesus. That's not the Christianity of Jesus you're tapping into. It's the Christianity of the white supremacist slave master religion that people like James Cone and others have tried to help America disentangle yourself from for now decades. And we're never going to be free until we do that. And lastly, of that toxic trifecta is the economic piece. Let us not ever lose sight of what type of economic exploitation is happening. Certainly on this land, when people were in bondage, were actually used as assets in actually producing the type of extraordinary wealth, billions of dollars extracted from black families in things like redlining and restricted covenant on the South Side. And when we talk about the economic exploitation of Palestinians in this moment, when we talk about some of the largest oil reserves outside of the Mediterranean, don't think that does not factor into the analysis that we're talking about today. So it is that toxic trifecta that we have to be up against. And in the last minute, because I do believe that spirituality and faith traditions, like the father alluded to, are not some feel-good. I know there are critics. I know there are cynics. They sometimes call it interfaiths, right? When they're talking about interfaith. I've heard that critique, but I'm among the people that take faith seriously. And I think many of you are. And I'm talking about the Bonhoeffer faith. The Bonhoeffer faith that called out cheap grace, right? Was asking for, a repentance without soliciting forgiveness. Let us be the people that acknowledge what Malcolm talked about, the 6-inch blade in my back, and that we don't begin to recover from that by when you just pull it out 3 inches. I still got 3 inches of a blade in my back. Pull that damn knife out my back, and then let's start talking about healing. Let's think about both the Jewish and Muslim concept of tshuva in Hebrew literally means the same thing, to turn back to God. Repentance is a turning away from. One of the most powerful things I witnessed, and I was a cynic of it initially because I have a dear Catholic friend on the South Side, Father Flager, who invited me, rebel rouser, right? But invited me once to be part of the tradition of washing the feet. He said, Rami, I want you on stage with me when I wash the feet. I said, Father, you ain't washing my feet. I said, I love you, my man, but you ain't washing my feet. I'll be on stage with you. I'll give you the talk. But he invited then returning residents, and he invited immigrants and refugees, and I was on stage, and I was not prepared, quite frankly, for how powerful that ceremony was and how it affected me. And you know why? Because I saw what the congregants could not see. I saw this white man on his knees washing the feet of returning residents and looking up at them and asking for forgiveness that we have failed you. Asking forgiveness from immigrants that we have failed you. And it emotionally hit me, and I wondered, and I contemplated afterwards why. Why did that hit me so hard? And what I realized is, we don't see public acts of forgiveness often. We don't see public solicitations of forgiveness. And I believe the pathway forward for Jews, Muslims, Christians, and people of faith is we all need to continue to connect to that land. Jerusalem is an international global city. I believe in that. It's as Palestinian as it is anything else. It is global. It's an ancient city that my father's family goes way back to. But it's a city of all of our faiths. And if we're going to connect and continue to have this faith connection to this land and see our people thrive, we need to publicly acknowledge the harm. What I pray and hope is that and we've all contributed, we're all complicit in the harm that's happened in Palestine, Israel. I hope our faith communities can lead a genuine faith movement that we're seeing on these campuses, where students are performing Maghrib, evening prayer, on the same mats that they're doing the Shabbat prayers on. And it's happening across this country, and no one is acknowledging how powerful and authentic expression of religious solidarity is happening right now. My prayer is that illustration of religious solidarity, the type that our beloved rabbi has led, that is not just a political, ideological expression of any kind, but that is the best of our human tradition that we all get to celebrate. And with that, I believe there's freedom for us all.